Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session this afternoon as we continue this important conversation that started last week as Treaties Recognition Week. And today we're going to continue that conversation. And you've noticed behind me here, I have a sea of poppies because today, November 8th, is known as Indigenous Veterans Day. So it's a date that's not known by many. We are more familiar with November 11th as Remembrance Day, but today is an important day as well. And also because we're all on this new learning journey through treaty education, it's another opportunity to bring in people who often are left out in education. So with me here is Troy, who's going to be helping in moderating your questions. There will be a question and answer period for this session. And for the teachers who are listening, you would have received an email with the link to the form. And if not, you can access that form down below in the description in the YouTube that you're watching right now. In the description box, there's a link to the question form. So please bring your questions forward. We'll do our very best to get through them all. And so I'm going to turn it over to Troy to introduce himself, and then Maurice to introduce himself and take it from here. So over to you, Troy.
Sego, Sego, Wahwanu Harado. Gastus Erdagero, Yongyats. Ganyonga Haga, Gandege. Good afternoon, everyone. It is really great to see everybody and be a part of today. I'm calling in, I guess you could say, from the beautiful Bay of Quinte area. So I'm from the Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, but we also refer to ourselves as Gundege, which is where Quinte actually derived from, was that Gundege word. But I'm certainly happy to be a part of this conversation today. It's extremely important, so great to be with everyone. Over to you, Maurice.
Oh, thanks, Miigwech, Nyawa, Troy. I'll introduce myself in my grandparents' language, which is Anishinaabemowin, or some people say Ojibwe, and it's important for people to hear the languages that Troy has just spoken and that I speak, because a lot of people think that Canada is what they call a bilingual country, and by bilingual they think of French and English. But the language that Troy just spoke and that I'm going to speak, those words, that language were spoken on these lands thousands and thousands of years before anybody came here from England or France. And it's really important. I noticed there was a really exciting development this past week where the province of Nova Scotia announced they were going to pass legislation that would recognize Mi'kmaq as an original language. I think that was a phenomenal thing for them to do. And that's the way I think Canada is moving, to recognize. When I went to school and I was in high school, they used to talk about the two founding nations of Canada. Well, French and English, God bless them, they didn't find North America or Canada any more than Columbus discovered anything. They were welcome to our shores, but they were not the first people here. So I'm going to greet you, and I'll translate what I said after. Ani bojo niji, Bnesi dijnakas wajashk dodam anashnabek, angwaro dodam hodnashoni. Alderville, Dunjiba, North Bay, and Diana, and Ashnabek, and Dow. So I said, greetings, friends, Niji. I said that a name I've been given is Bnesi, which is a bird, and it's a short form for Nimki Bnesi, which means thunder bird. And many Indigenous peoples have names given to them when they're born. Some of us get them later in our life when we have walked maybe in our Indigenous moccasins a bit more. I said that I have two clans, and those clans are families. People around the world use different ways of identifying their families. Scottish people have different colored tartans, and but that's how you identify your family from others, and that's very important when it comes to things like marriage, for example. You don't want to be marrying your own relatives. Indigenous peoples had these sophisticated systems of identifying clans, while the crowned heads of Europe were marrying their cousins all the time. They needed clans. They had have asked, we would have shared with them. But I said that on my grandfather Moses' side, he was the chief at the Mississaugas of Alderville in the early 1900s, and his clan was Muskrat, Wajushk, and the Muskrat plays an interesting role in our creation stories, actually. And on my great grandmother actually came from Troy's community, Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. Her name was Esther Hill, and through her I'm a Guaro or Wolf clan. And I said that my family roots are in the Mississaugas of Alderville First Nation, which is in eastern Ontario, east of Toronto, and sort of northeast of Cobourg, the little city of Cobourg. And I said that that we're part of the Anishinaabe Nation. And there are probably about 30 or 40 real nations of Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's confusing because people hear the term First Nation to describe those 600 and some communities across the country, but the communities are actually part of larger collectives of communities that share the similar language, similar culture, similar land base, similar laws, similar belief systems, and those are the nations. And in Ontario, we have, in what's called Ontario, we have the Anishinaabe Nation, we have the Mushkegowuk or Cree Nation, we have Haudenosaunee, and these lands have provided some homes for Métis people. Their real homeland is the Red River area in Winnipeg. So, and nations make treaties, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is the treaty relationship. And it's extremely important. This is a week of remembrance, as Ms. Williams said. This is National Indigenous Veterans Day, and it's important, and it was decided it was important for Indigenous veterans to have their own day, because we've been defending these lands longer than anybody else. We were here first, and we have defended these lands before there was a Canada. And I'll mention in my presentation that in the War of 1812, for example, Indigenous people were Canada's defense force. We were it. So I'm going to start, but again, as we remember things this week, and we remember people who've defended Canada, when we talk about treaties, hopefully the information that I'm going to share is going to help you remember that there wouldn't be a Canada if it weren't for First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples, agreeing to share the land that they had been, on which they had been the sole occupants for thousands and thousands of years. So, and we're going to have time for questions after. And I'm now going to, this is high tech for me, we're now going to share the screen. Okay. Everybody see that? Okay. I like to start my presentations by using this teaching, and I'm just going to give you the short version of it because it would take maybe a day or so or longer to do it in depth, but it's an important starting point because, this is the first Indigenous teaching I ever received, and actually I received it in a church hall on Tyendinaga Mohawk territory by a man named Jim Dumont. And basically this medicine wheel that is common to many people who see Indigenous teachings and issues, it contains 4 colors in that circle, and depending on where you are, the colors might be different, they might be in a different order, but this is the Anishinaabe version from this part of the country. And the teaching that I received said that the creator of all living things, when he sent the first person to this earth, he was in a lodge with that person. That person could be a man or a woman. And there's a fire at the center. Whenever I draw a medicine wheel, I always place a fire at the center. I don't just have intersecting lines. I have a fire at the center because that's the spark of all life. Some people say that the universe started with a big bang. Well, maybe it was a big spark. You know, scientists know everything about the human body. They know every molecule in our body, but they don't know what starts our engine. That's that spark. Nobody has ever identified how it starts. And that's the spark that we're taught is placed in us all living things. So the Creator said to that first person, when you go to that earth, you need 4 things to lead a good life. And in the East, the Creator showed that person plants, and this plant is a braid of sweetgrass, and that was to teach respect and kindness for all living things. In the South, there was a tree, and then the manner of that tree's growth up, that was to symbolize honesty. And in the West, there was a deer, and because many creatures give up their lives, particularly at this time of year, for humans to share, that was the gift of sharing. And one reason, by the way, now that we're talking about Remembrance Day, if you go to a powwow, among the first people to go into the powwow circle are our veterans, our warriors, because they have been prepared to share their lives to protect their people and their territories. And in the North, the Creator showed that first person a rock. This is a big rock. This is a mountain, and that symbolizes strength, and not physical strength, but perseverance and endurance, because rocks can last forever without undergoing any apparent change. So the Creator said, those are the gifts that you need to lead a good life when you go to that other place, and share them with others. So today, as we talk about treaties, those gifts are particularly meaningful and important. Oh, this is a hair trigger. Okay, so we're going to be talking about treaties and the treaty relationship. So we have to know what we're talking about. My goodness. So the dictionary will say something like this. It will say that a treaty is a ratified agreement between states or nations. It's not just between two, it can be between many. It's a legal agreement, it's a contract, and there are differences in what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to use the word Indian in the historic sense, Indian treaties. But the treaty concept is one that people think is European, but Indigenous peoples were using treaties between themselves before Europeans got here. And here's an example of a modern treaty. It's a treaty between the 3 North American countries for free trade. There's a man in the middle there with orange hair who looks like he's cheating on an exam. And he's looking over the shoulder of Canada's Prime Minister. I hope that he doesn't make the mistake, or didn't make the mistake, of copying our Prime Minister's name when he signs the document. But there are all kinds of contemporary treaties. They're treaties about trade, about promising not to proliferate nuclear weapons. And the world leaders meeting in Glasgow today, at the end of this week, they're going to come up with a document that is a treaty in which they will all pledge, to do something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and try to help reverse global climate change. How well they keep their promises remains to be seen. And the challenge with people who engage in treaty relationships is, how well do they keep their pledges? My hand is too quick. There we go. Okay, we're going to talk about Indian treaties. And again, that word Indian, well, I was taught in the school that the reason that word is used to describe North American Indians is because Columbus, that great Spanish explorer, was or Italian explorer, was looking for India in 1492. And so he washed up on the shores of the Caribbean island, maybe the Dominican Republic, maybe the Bahamas, and he saw these brown-skinned people and he said, aha, I must be in India, so let's call these people Indians. Well, the problem with that, because there wasn't even a country in the world called India in 1492. What Columbus's journal said, in fact, was he thought these people that he encountered were so comfortable in their natural surroundings that he said they were indios. That means with God. That story didn't make it into the textbooks. This is a typical Indian treaty gathering in Western Canada after Canadian Confederation. This would have been one of the numbered treaties. You can see the government official in the front under the canopy. There's always a military presence. This would be the Northwest Mounted Police, I believe. And the Indian chiefs listening to the promises that they were being made to get them to convince them to agree to a treaty. Remember, they didn't have to ask for a treaty. They already had the land. They didn't need a treaty. It was the Europeans who asked for treaties. And there's an interesting thing about these historic gatherings is that there weren't women at them. The Europeans brought many things on their boats. One of the things they brought was misogyny. They didn't have a respect for women, and they didn't invite women to the treaties, and they even told Indian chiefs, we don't want women there, which is, that attitude is why women didn't get to vote in most European elections until 100 years after this gathering. Interesting, dogs, it was okay for dogs to be at the treaty gathering, as you can see in the foreground, but not women. Before we talk about treaties, it's important, and I apologize for the overlap of the headline there, it's important to understand how European exploration took place. So why it took place was that the small little countries that form the subcontinent of Europe were looking for more land. You can fit almost all of Europe into basically Ontario. They didn't have much land. They had lots of people, and they were looking for ways to get more wealth. For one thing, they had to raise more money to pay for all the wars that they were constantly fighting in Europe. And so the church in the Middle Ages was an extremely important played an extremely important role for the crowned heads of Europe, the wealthy people who owned all the lands, and what the role the church played was to sort of reinforce the idea that kings and queens had, that they were there by divine right, that God literally placed them there, and so it was good political strategy whenever they did anything major to get the blessings of the church. And the Catholic Church in particular was the dominant Christian religion across Europe. In England had been Catholic, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal. And so before they started their big voyages of discovery, they decided they would ask for the church's blessing. And that came in the form of what are called papal bulls, B-U-L-L-S, that are really big pronouncements on the part of the head of the church. And again, that mythology that somehow these were inspired by God. And the papal bull, the first one was issued by Pope Benedict V in 1455. And that decreed that wherever European explorers from these countries went, if they encountered people in those countries that did not believe what they believed, the Europeans believed, in other words, if they weren't Christian and specifically Catholic, their lands could be treated as empty. Terra Nullius is the Latin phrase for empty land. It was kind of, if you describe this doctrine of discovery in modern terms, you'd say it was kind of a racist finders keepers. And the people on those lands were not to be regarded as even human, uncivilized, pagans, heathens. So that was the basis on which colonization took place all around the world. And scholars say that one reason why the church has yet to completely revoke this doctrine is that there's some question about whether the impact that would have on the very existence of countries like Canada that were founded on these principles. Would it delegitimize them? It's an interesting question, but the fact remains that the Pope has been asked. The current Pope was asked by our current Prime Minister several years ago, and there was no response. So it is still on the books. That's the mentality that led to exploration. Oh, this is. Okay, now the theory of Terra Nullius, empty land. Does that land look empty? No. There were hundreds of nations of indigenous peoples all over what we call Turtle Island, North America, and all over South America. It was far from empty. These are people that had different beliefs and laws and languages, but it certainly wasn't an empty land. And I want you to remember this map and how occupied it is, because when we show you a map later of what constitutes Indian lands in Canada today, it's considerably different. Now, when newcomers came here, again, we talked today about newcomers coming to Canada as refugees. They come from places like Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and they come from hardships. Most of the Europeans who came here, the settlers, they were refugees. They were refugees. They didn't own their own lands. They lived like slaves. They paid tribute to the lords, the wealthy ruling classes in Europe. They didn't have free speech. At the time when they first started coming here, if you stood up on the main town square in a capital city of Europe like London, England, or Madrid, Spain, or Rome, Italy, or Paris, France, if you stood up in 1500 and said, you know, I have just figured it out that the sun does not go around the earth goes around the sun. Well, you'd be burned at the stake. So you weren't allowed to say anything that contradicted the ruling classes or the church. They had no freedom of speech. Matter of fact, the only democracy some of these people had ever seen was what they found when they came to the Americas, the democracy practiced by Indigenous peoples, where everybody shared things. And one of the things that the Indigenous people shared, as long as people came peacefully, they shared with them information they needed to survive. They shared with them information about, for example, what food was safe to eat, what plants they could use, where they could get medicines, how they could create medicines out of plants if they got illnesses. Here there's an artist's rendition of some Indigenous people showing newcomers how they could get a sweetener out of tree. This is a sugar bush. You know, there are countless stories across Canada of how the Indigenous people saved various expeditions of Europeans from almost certain death by starvation or, you know, just the unfamiliarity with the climate. The French people the people from France were the first settlers to come in great numbers in the 1500s and the 1600s. And they had pretty good relations with the Indigenous peoples. They intermarried with them. They respected that they were on someone else's land and paid tribute for that privilege. The word that's commonly translated to English is gifts or presents, but it was rent. I don't know if any of you have driven on Highway 407, but when you drive on that highway, you don't give gifts to the owners. You pay a toll. You pay rent. But the French understood that and practiced it regularly. That you always, when you were on someone else's traditional land, that there was some sort of tribute that had to be given for the privilege to use their land. Now, the English soon saw, and the English had become the mightiest European empire probably in history, mightier than the Roman Empire, and they had hundreds of ships that ruled the seas of the world. They had started colonies in just about every continent, and they saw that the French had discovered some interesting resources here, not the least of which was furs. And the fur trade became a huge economic driver that attracted Europeans, a huge driver. And that also was the introduction in North America of what we now call capitalism, which talks about competition for resources and wealth. Before then, by and large, most Indigenous peoples had only taken from the land what they need, and for food, for shelter, for warmth, and shared it with everybody in their communities. But the Europeans introduced capitalism, wealth, creation of wealth for its own sake. And that for over a century resulted in some pretty major wars among Indigenous peoples. The Beaver Wars lasted for almost a century in the 1600s, in which the French and the British had allies, and the Allies got caught in the middle of these fights, and many of them died, basically over the European squabble about who controlled the fur trade. So, but by the middle of the 1700s, Britain they were again at war with France. They seemed to fight every 20 years or so. And in the war that some people call the 7 Years' War, some people call it the French and Indian War, the British came out on top here and abroad. And so the British became the preeminent European colonizer in what's now Canada and what was becoming the United States. They had established colonies south of us and in the eastern part of what's Canada. And the relationship got off to a rocky start because the British had an arrogance in them. Some of their commanders, like a man named Geoffrey Amherst, as a military leader, he had no use for the Indian people. He disagreed with the French habit of paying tribute to them. And he even suggested a strategy to some of his officers to infect blankets that would be traded with the Indians with smallpox, which was probably the first example of germ warfare ever on the North American continent. We hope the last. This so upset, obviously, the change in attitude on the part of the British, that a great leader who we know as Pontiac, but whose name was Obundiug, he was an Odawa chief, and he and a spiritual leader called Neolin, they met with some of the British. And it's recorded that they told them, just because you've defeated the French, don't think you're our masters. And Pontiac proceeded in short order to capture 9 of 11 British forts. This was an awful shock to the British, who they defeated the French. They were the mightiest armies and navies in the world. And that kind of rattled them. So they so desperately wanted to maintain and increase their foothold in the New World that they decided they were going to rely on diplomacy. And in 1763, his advisors convinced King George III of England to issue the Royal Proclamation. And I think I see it behind Troy's head, I think, on the wall there. Yeah. And it said many things, but among the things it said was it recognized that the Indian tribes of North America were nations. And it said that they have land rights. And those are principles that are still being recognized in today's courts, in the Supreme Court in this country. And it also promised that they would not allow settlers to, in the words of the treaty, molest the Indians in their own land. So they would protect them against settlers. So they also promised that they would reserve the center part of North America, the whole continent, west of their little settlements in the east of Canada and the eastern seaboard of the United States, that whole center of North America west of the Appalachian Mountains would be reserved as Indian territory. No settlers were to even set foot in that if they shared the land to the east of the mountains. So that was a huge promise, and that really helped convince the Indian leaders. So the problem was their email system was down in 1763. It was broken. So they decided they better have meetings and tell the Indian leaders in person this. So they set a big meeting for the following year near Niagara Falls. Wasn't this close to Niagara Falls, but we took some artistic license. And the chief negotiator was going to be the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for British North America, which is pretty well the whole continent. And his name was William Johnson. And we gave him yellow hair so he would stand out, but he almost certainly didn't have yellow hair. He would have had a gray powdered wig. And this was the largest gathering of Indian leaders ever held on this continent. Some people say there were as many as 3,000 leaders attended. And Sir William Johnson's job was to, in person at council fires with groups of chiefs over the month of July 1764, was to reiterate the pledges of the Royal Proclamation, including the pledge for the Indian Territory. And he faulted the promise by giving these chiefs 30,000 gifts, guns and ammunition and pots and pans and blankets and all sorts of things that Indians wouldn't have had. And he also gave them 6,000 pounds sterling, which is still used as English money, and 6,000 pounds sterling in 1764 today has a purchasing power of $20 million. This is a huge, huge event in Canadian history, in North American history. When I went to school, there was never anything in the textbooks about this event. Confederation, 103 years later, almost certainly wouldn't have happened if this event hadn't happened, if those leaders hadn't agreed to accept Sir William Johnson's promises. And at the time he gave the gift, Sir William Johnson in his diary says that he said, your people will never be poor as long as the sun rises in the east. Just whatever you need, just call on us and we will bring it in our ships. Just all you have to do is take up the belt that binds you to the English. And the belt was this blue wampum belt. It would have been more purple than blue. And it was made from the shells, the beads of seashells called quag shells that had been used by people from the east coast of Canada from early days. The Mohawk people, the Kanien'kehá:ka people, had made a belt called the Gaswenta, the two-row wampum. The first settlers they met from Holland in what's now New York State. And those beads were sacred. They came from shells that were in the water. Anything that lives in the water is regarded as sacred by Indigenous people. And that wampum belt made those promises. It's very sacred. And again, the difference between modern treaties and European treaties and Indian treaties, two things. One, they were sacred ceremonies. There would have been pipes smoked, a sacred ceremony in which if you share a pipe with an Indian leader with holding sema or tobacco, we believe that your prayers and promises go up in that smoke. And it's the same as if you were a witness in a court trial and you were asked to promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth by putting your hand on a Bible. So there were sacred ceremonies. And the other difference, in addition to being legal and contractual, there was no expiry date on these treaties. A teacher told me one time, and his research showed him that the difference between Indigenous and European attitudes toward treaties is that Europeans tended to sign treaties at the end of something, like a war, and the Indigenous peoples thought the treaties marked the beginning of a relationship. And they were supposed to be, so they wouldn't forget the promises. They would have gatherings at least once a year and recite the promises. The Europeans could write it all down on paper. The Indians didn't need to, they could remember, and they had people whose job it was to remember. And so this was the start, the major start of the treaty relationship that made possible the existence of Canada, this event. Treaty of Niagara in 1764. The center of the wampum belt shows two figures. Both of them had hearts depicted. You can see the handshake. Remember the handshake. It's a universal symbol of friendship and peace and sharing. Someday when people come here from Mars, they will hire an Indigenous woman to make a wampum belt showing this symbol. So, and the Martians will recognize that means friendship. You put your hand out and hold someone's hand, that means friendship. You can see hearts are depicted. Indigenous peoples always believed that meant that this was a true ceremony, that they were sacred promises. You notice there's a difference in the way that the two hearts were depicted. We think the one on the left is it represents the Indian leaders. And the quote above, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was finalized in 2015, among its 94 recommendations were a renewal of the treaty relationship. And as early as the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples 25 years earlier, there had been suggestions that the Royal Proclamation be reissued to help create understanding of what it means and why it's still considered a paramount foundational principle of Canadian law. You've heard me talk about treaties as a legal document, a contractual document. In this book for elementary school kids that we talked about with about 10,000 elementary school students this morning, this character says a treaty is a fancy word for promise. And the Anishinaabemowin word for treaty is Wawindamagewin, and that means mutual promises. Now here's a typical image of a treaty that would have been in the colonies. And you can see the person representing the government, as in that earlier depiction of a Canadian numbered treaty gathering, dressed in his officer's finery as a treaty commissioner representing his colony. And you can see someone has got on the table in front of him a written version of the treaty, but the Indian chief is presenting a wampum belt. That would be his understanding. Now, there would have been translators to translate what the promises were. Unfortunately, we now realize that in some cases intentionally, and many cases intentionally, the translated version of what was in the treaty or what was not in the treaty was not always effective. In some cases, it was deliberately misleading. In the upper left-hand corner, that's the Treaty of Niagara wampum belt. The date is on it. It's significant because most treaty belts did not have dates. This was a huge event. And on either side of the two figures representing the Indians and the British are figures that have been interpreted as the covenant chain. And from the earliest days of treaty making with Europeans, peace and friendship, for example, between the Canyagahaga and the Dutch, the agreements were considered a covenant chain. A covenant, again, a word meaning it's a sacred agreement. And those are links of a chain. And there have been some people who interpret, if you ever get a chance to see the wampum belt, the dish with one spoon, some people, because the center of those links, it looks a lot like the dish with one spoon. but we don't know that for sure, but it's possible. You can see all across Canada, these are the numbered treaties that began after Canadian Confederation in 1867. You can see that most of Canada is under these, comes under the terms of these specific treaties. And by this time, and we'll talk about it after we talk about the War of 1812, by this time the treaties, partly I think, I'm sure, because by this time the settlers greatly outnumbered Indians. When the first big treaties were signed, the Indians greatly outnumbered the settlers, so they were a bit more humble. But by this time, the treaty process was not an honorable process. It was deliberately intended to just get the Indians off the land so they could open it up for settlement and the new plans for the new Johnny MacDonald's new railway, the Canadian Pacific Railway. Every square inch of Ontario is under treaty, 46 treaties. And there's so many of them in Southern Ontario that they can't even name them all on this slide. Every square inch is under treaty. And this is a medal that was given to chiefs who were involved in treaty signings. I shouldn't say signing because they couldn't sign it, they couldn't read it, or couldn't write the language. In treaty enactments, treaty ceremonies. You can see the government treaty commissioner again on the left, again the handshake, that familiar symbol of peace, friendship, sharing, alliance. Behind the treaty commissioner is the sun, which has been interpreted as that the agreements would last as long as the sun shines, as long as it rises. The Indian chief, that Indian chief has a six-pack. He must work out a lot. He must have worked out a lot, that chief. You don't see too many Indian chiefs, I don't think, with a six-pack like that. But anyways, he's fit. This is a medal. On the other side of that medal would have been a picture of the reigning monarch, and most of the numbered treaties would have been Queen Victoria. Not all of the numbered treaties, actually. And in Treaty 6, which this medal was for the Cree people in part of what's now Alberta, Saskatchewan, among the promises that were made in exchange for the Indians agreeing to share their land were, your people will always have a medicine chest. That's healthcare. Your people will always have a schoolhouse. That's education. The Supreme Court of Canada has said that the treaties must be interpreted in the way that the Indians understood them. Unfortunately, we're still paying for our children to attend schools in someone else's jurisdiction. They call them tuition agreements, even though they were covered by treaty. And I said that Indigenous peoples, our job was to remember what was said, and they could recite treaty promises decades after the treaties, while the Europeans wrote everything down. And one of the lieutenant governors of the new colony, Sir Francis Bond Head, this is his quote, that an Indian's word is one of the strongest moral securities on earth. If they made a promise, and particularly if it was a promise made in a sacred ceremony, you could count on them to keep their promise. These two slides show something really important about treaties. Remember I said that I don't think there was a treaty signed in a historic treaty signed in Canada in which the chiefs could read what was in the treaty, the promises that were made or the conditions. They accepted the word of translators. It was in a sacred ceremony. They wouldn't have imagined anybody would ever lie in a sacred ceremony. And this treaty that involves my First Nation in Alderville uses words like surrender and cede, C-E-D-E, meaning give up. Indigenous peoples could never imagine selling their land. That would be if you lived in a place where there was only one grocery store and you agreed to sell it to someone or to close it. Canada, the land is, if you're an Indigenous person, the land is it's your grocery store. It's how you eat. So they couldn't imagine this, but that's how some of these these treaty violations took place, many of them deliberate. Now, the next slide, you look at the names there of the Indian chiefs. You can see that their names are all written in the same handwriting. And that means that one person wrote them all, and that person would have been a treaty clerk. And on the right, after the agreement, there would have been a big red wax seal melted on it to make it official. But the images of all those animals and birds, those are their clan signs, their totems, And there would have been perhaps one of those hoof clans, perhaps is a moose or a caribou or an elk. There's a bird there. Could have been a ruffed grouse, could have been an eagle. My muskrat clan could have been that little animal at the bottom there. Could have been a muskrat, an otter. So again, that's very important to understand that when the treaties were agreed to, in some cases, the chiefs were directed just to make an X with the pen. They could not read what was in the treaties, and they accepted that they were being told the truth. These are our documents. Those are wampum belts made from those sacred shells. Some of them are made from reproduction beads because the shells are extremely expensive. And some of those treaties were between nations. There's a belt there, 1, 2, 3, fifth from the left. That's an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. The line between the two rectangles representing the nations shows peace. If you went to war with someone that you'd made a treaty with, one of the customs was to dye the belt with red ochre for blood. But those are our versions of documents. And this is again probably south of us. You can see a person in the 1600s or 1700s holding a piece of paper, probably a treaty agreement. And kneeling is a treaty commissioner about to share a pipe with an Indian chief or leader. Again, the ceremony. What's on the paper, promise, it's this, what we've told you, and we promise it in the eyes of the Creator. And we promise it will last forever, those promises. So the first time that big Treaty of Niagara was tested was only 48 years later. And it was the only war ever fought on Canadian soil. And our neighbors to the south, the colonists that had started as a British colony in what was to become the United States, they broke away in 1783. They had a revolution. They didn't want to be colonists anymore. They didn't want a king. And they attacked Canada because they wanted to take this British colony as part of their colony. They thought they were going to expand and occupy the entire continent. And they had an army, a trained army of about 30 or 35,000. Remember, in all of what we call Ontario, there probably weren't 10,000 Europeans at this time. And there were only about 1,000 or 1,500 trained British soldiers west of Montreal. So the leader, the political and military leader of what was then what is now Ontario, later became called Upper Canada, was a man named Sir Isaac Brock. And he made a very wise move. And his move was to enlist the support of an Indian leader from Ohio named Tecumseh. And Tecumseh was particularly eager to be an ally of the British because the Americans, after they broke away from Britain, they ignored the Royal Proclamation that they weren't supposed to go west of the Appalachian Mountains, and they started to invade Indian communities, including ones in Tecumseh's territory. So Tecumseh played an instrumental role in helping forge an alliance among tribes north and south of the Great Lakes. And in fact, Canada's major defense force, and there were I think there were 10 battles fought in the war, all of them in southern Ontario. And Canada's Defence Force consisted of 10,000 Indian warriors. And some of them were Anishinaabe, some of them were Haudenosaunee, Iroquois. And you have heard the name Sir Isaac Brock, to whom there's a huge 180-foot statue near Niagara Falls, where he was killed in one of the early battles at the Battle of Queenston Heights. And they have just recently put up some memorials to the Indians who have played a huge role, of course, the biggest role. But you've never heard of their names. And I'm going to suggest some names too. Their names like Pakinawattik, Asiganak, Meskwaki, Joseph Norton, Oshawanu, Shawundas, Shingwakons. And if you look at a resource that is available, you teachers, on the First Nations Métis and Inuit Education Association of Ontario website, and if you want to become a member of that association, they have resources about those leaders and the roles they played, things that have not been included in our history books. So this was a monumental event in history, and unfortunately, although again it preserved Canada's sovereignty as a colony, the Indians had fought to protect their own lands, and they had kept their treaty promise that they had made at Niagara. Unfortunately, after the war, when the threat of the war invasion disappeared, the French were no longer a threat, the Americans' invasion had been thwarted, they were no longer a threat. Unfortunately, the Europeans thought, well, now we can increase immigration exponentially. And whereas there were maybe 10, maybe 12,000 Europeans in what's now Ontario, by 1850, there were 1 million Canadians, Canadian colonists in the eastern part of the country. And there's a cartoon in which the Americans like to say that the British lost the War of 1812. The British like to say the Americans lost, but really the Indigenous people suffered the most because they did most of the fighting. They suffered severe losses and casualties. And as the European population increased, they also became more and more prone to illnesses to which they had no immunity, and and they were vastly outnumbered, which meant that the promises that had been made, the Europeans did not feel compelled to honor them anymore. And I mentioned earlier, if you think of that map that shows the complete occupation of these lands by Indigenous peoples, by not too long after Confederation and the establishment of reserves, these little ghettos into which Indians were forced to move. There are 600 of those little dots, and they represent 0.02% of Canada's landmass. That's a drastic change in only about 150, 200 years. Amazing change. And again, the Indigenous peoples had suffered greatly because of their involvement in the War of 1812 in the prairies. The Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister, publicly said in the House of Commons that he would adopt a policy of starvation to withhold rations that were promised as part of the treaties, settlements, to force the Indians to accept treaties and to move on to reservations, reserves, as they call them here. And there were attempts at resistance, even though their numbers were declining and they were outgunned militarily and in numbers. Leaders like Big Bear and Poundmaker and Louis Riel, but it was fruitless. And the government's response was to publicly hang leaders who had dared to defy, their sovereignty. And these quotes are really interesting. And if you wonder why Indigenous peoples are not crazy about statues to people like Johnny MacDonald and having schools named after him, it's because of the things that he did in Canada's history. And here's a typical comment: just they just wanted to get the land away from Indians, just get the land away from them and open it for settlement. And they would offer the land free without ever having really compensated for it. They would offer it free, the settlers. And here's a Mississauga chief whose quote is really, kind of sad. He said, "You, the British, came, you were blown across the ocean by the winds, and you came to our shores and we nursed you. We planted you like a little tree, and then you became a mighty tree and used your big branches to lash us." Very poetic. So among the things that were government priorities, again, the treaty process was all but forgotten by now. They implemented the Indian Act, which is still in existence and hasn't really changed too much in 150 years. And you remember that racist finders keepers doctrine of discovery, the Terra Nullius, empty land. The people aren't really human that occupy it. Well, that's basically what the Indian Act said when it was implemented. A person means an individual other than an Indian. Indians had to get passes to leave the reserves, and most Indians in the early parts of Canada's history were forced to be on reserve. And this system was thought to be so effective that the apartheid government of South Africa in the 1960s, they sent a delegation here to study how that system worked, and they used it at home to restrict the movement of people they called colored. The Indian Act outlined our cultural activities. There are recorded instances of people going to jail for dancing traditional dances. And again, that's not entertainment. The dances and singing and drumming, those are sacred activities. They have spiritual connection. So our belief system was outlawed, and our sacred items were confiscated, including many of the wampum belts that were used to signify those agreements. And our pipes, our sacred items, it would be as if, can you imagine the government going into churches and confiscating all their crucifixes and chalices and everything. They confiscated their sacred items. And of course, the biggest crime ever committed in this country was the crime of the residential school system. I don't talk much about it because I'm not a survivor. My grandfather ran away from a day school, training school. And I'll just give you the numbers for about 200 years in Canada. 130 residential schools and dozens of day schools were operated, to which Indigenous peoples were forced to send their children or on threat of going to jail. Thousands of children suffered various kinds of abuse. And we now know that we've always known, but Canadians now understand that many of those children died without their parents ever being notified. And I tell you that if Prime Minister Trudeau's child, one of his children, did not come home from school tonight, I guarantee you that every police officer and soldier in the city of Ottawa would be out looking for her. That would be a crime that could not happen in Canada. And we are finding mass graves of Indian children who were shoveled in to those graves with no respect or dignity. And more than anything else, that talks about the attitude that this country had towards Indigenous peoples. They wanted to make us disappear. They wanted to make our children disappear. They wanted to make our treaties disappear. In this week of remembrance, nobody has defended Canadian land more than Indigenous peoples. Going back to Tecumseh and those leaders I mentioned to you, Corporal Francis Pigmagabo from Wissahickon First Nation near Parry Sound was one of the most decorated Canadian soldiers in the First World War. He won the Military Medal for Bravery 3 times, almost unheard of in soldiers that fought to defend Britain and her allies in the First World War. And interestingly, you can see that big medal on his chest. I believe that's a treaty medal with Queen Victoria's picture on it. He might well have inherited that from his father or a relative in his First Nation for their role in the War of 1812 or in agreeing to a treaty. And on the left, Sergeant Tommy Prince from Broken Head Indian Reserve in Manitoba was one of the most decorated Canadian soldiers in World War II and in the Korean conflict. Canadians need to know and remember that Indigenous peoples have always contributed to the welfare of this country. And they still do. There are now 3,000 Canadians in the Canadian Armed Forces, but we contribute in many, many other ways to make Canada a good country. There is now a National Aboriginal Veterans Monument. The word Aboriginal now is Indigenous. And today, at National Indigenous Veterans Day, there will be ceremonies around that monument again, because we have defended, our ancestors have defended these lands before anybody else. In my little community of Alderville, today there are only about 300 people live there, 350. At the time of the First World War, there were 63 adult men living in Alderville, 63. 38 of them volunteered for military service. I'm going to read you some names. William Blaker, Joshua Blaker, Victor Blaker, Austin Beaver, Samson Cumago, William Hagar, William Franklin, Archie Simpson, Richard Tobacco. Those are the 9 men out of those 38 that volunteered that died fighting for Canada. I have 3 uncles' names on that war memorial that was erected almost 100 years ago. That's how important. You won't see many communities that have a war memorial like this in Canada. That's almost as big as the National War Memorial. That's a little place like Alderville that how highly they regard the sacrifice, the ultimate act of sharing that members of their community made in all of the conflicts. And I have 3 uncles' names and a great uncle and a grandfather's names on there for their contribution to Canada. Now, in some of the treaties, in addition to the promises, there were payments to be made. And remember, I said that there were supposed to be annual meetings. And the government, that was the first sign that the treaty promises were going to be broken. They stopped having the meetings. They stopped giving the annual gifts like were made at Niagara because the government said we can't afford it. So this is an early treaty meeting, I believe, of Treaty 9 in Northern Ontario. And a treaty commissioner is presenting this chief with a cash payment. The annuities were just very small amounts of money that date back to when the treaties were implemented, in this case, 1905. And there's always a mounted policeman there to show the military presence of the might of Canada. And you notice the Indian chief looks like he has a new suit on. Among the many promises that were made to chiefs, where if they signed, they agreed to the treaties, they would get a new suit of clothes every year. I've never met an Indian chief, and I've met hundreds of them, who's ever received a suit of clothes. That's a very small treaty promise, but it shows the attitude towards the promise. That payment would be an annuity. They no longer even read the treaty promises. I think it's too embarrassing.
Maurice.
Yo.
Just checking out the time, we're a little bit after 2 o'clock here.
Yeah.
So I think we're only going till 2. So
oh, I thought we were going to 2:30.
Oh, Jody, maybe you can clarify that for us. I'm sorry, I thought we were going till 2.
No, it's till 2.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, I'll wrap up quickly here then. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think it's what you're sharing is really good. And of course, as we're talking about Indigenous people, contributing to the efforts, it also makes me think of, something that you and I are very familiar with is the Oka crisis and how the military was actually coming in, to combat, if you will, Mohawk people who are actually fighting to protect their land, something that Mohawk people had been trying to do for Canada, right? So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there just as you were talking, the juxtaposition of everything, right? So
yeah.
Well, go ahead, wrap up. Sorry.
I will. Thanks for the reminder. This is a modern treaty gathering, and again, the payments, in this case, the payments are $5, and this lady might have her payment and her children's payments, I think. And there's currently a big court case going on about the treaty annuities for the Robinson Huron Treaty, which have been $4 a year since 1874 for lands in which trillions of dollars of resources have been extracted by mining and forestry companies. That's gone to court. These are examples of Indigenous peoples who contribute to Canada and continue to contribute, not historically, currently, whether in the fields of medicine or sports or arts or politics. Everybody that's listening to me has treaty rights and responsibilities. The handshake, we hope, was not just this kind of handshake, shake hands and cross your fingers like you're not telling the truth. The treaties are being broken every single day. The Mi'kmaq fisher boats are being burned, they're being attacked. And despite the fact that, as this statement says on the right, that the highest law in this land, the Canadian Constitution, recognizes that treaty rights must be recognized and affirmed. This is me talking to school teachers from Oshawa, I think, at the Curve Lake Powwow about these wampum belts from Niagara. And again, if we think about the treaty rights and responsibilities that all Canadians have and how important they were to Canada, they need to be treated with respect, honesty, sharing, and strength if Canada is indeed going to be the wonderful nation that it wants to be. So, Miigwech.
Well, thanks again, Maurice. It's such good information, and for all of us to remember. And the fact that you took it back to to North America, even at the very beginning, as we were both introducing ourselves in our language, I think is really, really important. Up to today, right? Like all of those things, when we're talking about treaties and we're talking about Indigenous rights, it's today, and it involves all of us. It's not just you and I as Indigenous people. This is everybody. So it's super, super important. And I encourage people, teachers on the call with us today, to investigate and learn more about those Indigenous veterans that we've been talking about. You highlighted a few of them today, from way back, and there's a lot still today, right? And I think it's really important to think about maybe Indigenous veterans also as protectors, right? So today we see a lot of people who are standing up for those Indigenous rights, but they're also protecting, right? It is about that land and protecting the land. So I think that's another common thing that came throughout your presentation, was that there was a lot of people involved in protecting land for one reason or another. And even after so many bad things had happened, Indigenous people were still willing to step up and adhere to those original treaty agreements. So again, Maurice, thank you for sharing that. Nyawagoa. And back to you, Jody.
Well, I think maybe we'll just bring it back to Maurice to give us some final words as we're over time. Sorry, Maurice, about the mix-up of time, because I know secondary classes are wrapping up as well. So if you want to just leave us with a few words here.
Yeah, sure. And I'm sorry that we didn't have a chance to to get some feedback, but this, hopefully my presentation will encourage people to want to learn more, teachers and students. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the things that I've learned with you, and again, encourage you. You students are going to be the leaders of this country. You know, in the years ahead, you're going to be the doctors and lawyers and judges and members of parliament and mayors and journalists. So you're learning these things that many of your parents and grandparents didn't know about this country. And hopefully that will make you better informed citizens, and with a greater understanding of justice and fairness. And so I appreciate you listening, and I wish you all good health and happiness. And again, I always wish students, I hope you'll get all A's on your report cards.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Maurice, and thank you, Troy.